Today, the term comic book is synonymous with superheroes. That's not always the case. The two largest North American comic book publishers, Marvel and DC, practically invented the modern superhero mythos. And for almost 70 years, comic book media has been dominated by primarily superhero-centric stories, such as Spider-Man, Batman, Wonder Woman, and the Fantastic Four. However, there once was a time when the comic book landscape relished in a range of genres. At one point, genres like horror and crime rivaled that of the great Superman. But why did these once popular genres fall off while superhero media continues to thrive to this day? In truth, these genres did not fall off. Instead, they were killed, and the culprit is none other than Dr. Frederick Wertham and the Comics Code Authority.
What do you think of the idea that Superman stands for truth and justice the American way?
Well, how can one stand for something which doesn't exist?
Okay, but who exactly is Dr. Frederick Wertham? And what is the Comics Code Authority, also known as the CCA? To explain that, we first need to take a look at the early comic book history. During the mid-20th century, thanks to advancements in printing technology, comic books were becoming one of the fastest growing consumer media. The medium was specifically popular with children, with the likes of characters of Superman and Captain America. However, like all other forms of entertainment, there were a multitude of books that each attracted unique audiences. However, the fact that series intended for children would sit on shelves right next to titles that were targeted at more mature crowds left some parents uneasy. Ultimately, the concerns of the parents would be turned into outright terror due to the proclamations of Dr. Frederick Wertham. Dr. Wertham was a German-born psychiatrist who in 1922 traveled to the United States after studying under and interacting with Dr. Emil Kraepelin and Sigmund Freud. The teachings of both men would have a great impact on Wertham's belief, specifically the principle that environment and social background influence psychological development in disease state. Essentially, Wertham believed that our experiences as children had a profound impact on our development psychology. After arriving in the United States, Wertham concluded that he needed to make a name for himself by launching a campaign against one of the newest facets of American pop culture. Wertham seemingly made it his life goal to heavily censor and restrict the content portrayed in comic books, after seemingly concluding to himself that comic books suggested to children were responsible for creating an atmosphere of deceit, trickery, and cruelty. Wertham was so committed to his belief that, despite statistics to the contrary, he believed that juvenile delinquency was growing in brutality, with comic books being the sole cause for this trend. Wertham's conflict with the comic book content would eventually culminate with the release of his book, Seduction of the Innocent. Nowadays, in modern academic circles, Wertham's novel is considered a vindictive falsification of the comic book medium and its effects on children due to its outlandish accusations. For example, Wertham argued that the characters of Batman and Robin were secretly homosexuals and their relationship was turning comic book audiences gay. However, despite how we might view Wertham's novel today, at the time of release, Wertham's writing resonated deeply with fearful parents and concerned citizens. Thus, following the release of Wertham's book in 1954, an outright moral panic had been directed at the comic book industry. Moral panics are instances of mass fear based on the false or exaggerated perception that some cultural behavior or group of people is dangerously deviant and poses a threat to society's values and interests. Thanks to Wertham's rhetoric, people were afraid that comic books were turning impressionable children into juvenile delinquents. Following this public outrage, horror and crime comics were being scrutinized more than ever, with dozens of examples of organized protests. In some of these cases, books were banned from newspaper stands, while in other instances, angry citizens began organizing local book burnings. Eventually, out of fear of government intervention, some comic book publishers came together under the banner of the Comics Magazine Association of America and decided the best course of action would be to establish their own content guidelines and begin self-regulating comic books. Thus, the Comics Code Authority was created. Even though the CMAA had final say in the guidelines enforced by the code, due to pushback from parents, the comic book publishers who crafted the code conceded to the demands of the critics and created a code that attempted to diminish what was believed to cause juvenile delinquency. The guidelines enforced by the code stated that comics could not include any horror or supernatural elements, crime could never be portrayed sympathetically, authority should never be questioned, violence should be relegated to a minimum, while sex, drugs, profanity should never be illustrated. Concerning Dr. Wortham, although he had no hand to play in the creation of the code, his rhetoric is seen all over the guidelines and restrictions. Despite this, Dr. Wortham never approved the code. Instead, he argued for an outright ban on all comic book media. What made the code different from other content rating systems is that while for movies, the Motion Picture Association would give a rating that correlated with the content of a product, i.e. more mature films would be rated R, while films that were considered kid-friendly would be rated PG. In contrast, the code worked more like a stamp of approval. If an individual issue of a comic did not meet the code's strict guidelines, the issue would not receive the code's stamp of approval. Therefore, instead of having a variety of stories that ranged in content material, the code created a hodgepodge of comics that were all standardized under the same strict guidelines. If a comic was unfortunate enough to not receive approval from the code, many newsstands and stores were unwilling to carry said comic. Despite not being required by law, the code stamp was still just as necessary for a comic publisher if they intended to make a profit. Needless to say, the code was a huge setback in the world of comic book storytelling, especially considering that crime and horror comics were killed practically overnight. Following the introduction of the code, the comic book industry entered what is known as the comic book Silver Age, a period in comic book history dominated by superhero silliness. Superheroes were by far the most popular genre of this era, as the industry as a whole shifted to accommodate the demands of the code. To the uninformed, there's a belief that comic books are nothing more than campy stories aimed at children. These stereotypes are a result of this era of comic books. Following the release of the code, comic books were definitively a medium for children, and room for nuanced and mature storytelling had been completely suppressed. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with campy superhero stories. The problem here is that there were no alternatives for audiences outside of said superhero stories. Imagine, if you will, a world where movie studios were only allowed to release films that received a PG rating. In this reality, movies like The Godfather, Saving Private Ryan, Shawshank Redemption would have never been made. When viewed in this context, you can't help but wonder what great comics we never got to see thanks to the limitations of the code. To fully understand how the code hindered comic book creators' ability to tell nuanced stories, I'd like to point your attention to EC Comics. Originally, EC Comics were known as educational comics, and they printed Bible stories. But as the cultural zeitgeist evolved, educational comics changed its name to entertainment comics after shifting focus to printing horror and crime comics. EC Comics became known for their titles such as A Vault of Horror, Haunt of the Fear, and Tales from the Crypt, which decades later would be adapted into an anthology horror TV show. Under the authority of the code, many of EC's comics could not be published, solely based on their titles alone. This was no accident, considering many of the members of the CMAA were editors from rival publishers. To combat this, EC Comics tried to shift focus away from horror and into science fiction. Before the code, EC had already released original science fiction stories, one of which was Judgment Day, written by Al Feldstein and illustrated by Joe Orlando. Originally, Judgment Day was released in Weird Fantasy number 18 in 1953. For those that don't know, Judgment Day is a science fiction story that depicts an astronaut visiting an alien planet populated by robots. The astronaut was sent to the planet on a reconnaissance mission to determine if the robot species is advanced enough to join the Intergalactic Federation. The astronaut discovers that the robot society is dependent on discrimination, which is decided by the color of individual robots. The discovery leads the astronaut to deem the robot planet not civilized enough to join the Intergalactic Federation. And for the first time, on the final page of the story, the astronaut takes off his helmet, revealing that he was a black man the whole time. Considered the time of the story's release and the way that minorities were typically portrayed in comics and media in general, Judgment Day was a highly progressive and radical story that challenged its audiences. Despite the controversy associated with the comic, it was still released with its message intact. Following the release of the code, EC would attempt to reprint Judgment Day in its original form as a part of their new title, Incredible Science Fiction. However, the code administration forbade the story from being reprinted unless its main character was changed into a white man. Bill Gaines, an editor at EC Comics, refused to censor Judgment Day's reprint and compromise the original story, believing that the astronaut's race was the whole point of the story. EC Comics would go on to re-release Judgment Day, but it would also be the last comic the company ever published. To further illustrate the point, the code and its impact on comics were limited only to titles published in the United States. Thus, in foreign markets that didn't rely on American audiences, comics were allowed creative freedom to explore a wider range of stories. Take, for example, Japan and its comic book equivalent, manga. For anyone interested in getting into manga, there are plenty of unique stories, whether that be romance, crime, sports, or action. Manga thrives as a medium of entertainment because of its variety. Without that, there wouldn't be much to separate it from American comics. Thanks in part to anime, manga's popularity has grown in recent years, to the point that American audiences have begun consuming its content. In the current comic book landscape, Marvel and DC are no longer competing with each other. Now they're competing with manga. If manga was able to become so popular here in the West, it just shows that audiences desire a wider range of stories. Manga's growing popularity further illustrates my point that the Comics Code Authority and its lasting consequences are what's holding the American comic book medium back. The code would remain a mainstay of the comic book landscape for decades to come. However, the code faced its first sign of pushback in 1984. At the time, artist Stephen R. Bissett and legendary comic book writer, as well as self-proclaimed wizard Alan Moore, teamed up at DC to write Swamp Thing. Feeling as though the code stifled their creative vision, Moore and Bissett refused to censor issue 29 of Swamp Thing, and thus DC published the title without the code's approval. Issue 29 would be published, and despite not meeting the code's guidelines, Swamp Thing would still go on to be both financially and critically successful. Swamp Thing's success ushered in a new age of more adult-oriented comic books, such as Watchmen, The Dark Knight Returns, and Hellblazer. Both Marvel and DC moved on from the code, instead choosing to embrace more mature content that could appeal to a whole new audience. Eventually, in 2010, the Comics Code Authority would officially be considered defunct. Nowadays, the comic book medium is in a creatively healthy place, at least in terms of variety of storytelling. However, the nonsensical adventures of Batman and Robin from the Silver Age are how many uninformed people still view comics to this day. If this is you, and you think that all comics are made to appeal to children, I urge you to expose yourself to more comics. Comic books are objectively an art form, and all forms of art deserve our attention. Thank you for your time. My name is Aiden Mendes, and this was the Geekology.